Bonjour, I am Vera and Natalia, and you are in the WIKI on Pfizer's COVID-19 vaccine. I'm joined today by Natalia Yurieva, a journalist passionate about investigating human trafficking and reporting on the exploitation of the most vulnerable.
Hello, здравствуйте. Thank you for having me.
We're so happy to have you with us. Give us a bit of a human perspective and break things down a little bit, so we're so thrilled. In the WIKI, we go in depth to discuss the stories we cover. As we are open source journalism, you can follow and fact check our stories on in24.ca. Also watch us uncensored on MSMU.me on Channel 1. Follow us on YouTube and Twitter at Internet News, and check out our website at in24.ca. Now, before we begin, a brief disclaimer. We are breaking down the facts and figures related to this vaccine, but at certain times we might dive into the realm of speculation, especially when connecting points and giving our interpretation. So as always, we encourage you to read the provided reference documents, develop your own view based on your lived experience, of course supported by our research, perhaps. So to begin, Pfizer and BioNTech's mRNA vaccine is being administered to people in the UK, Canada, and the US after being approved for emergency use in these nations. Although the rapid approval of this vaccine was the answer to the adverse effect of the COVID-19, the very experimental nature of this technology and its unprecedented use raised concerns over safety and efficacy claims. So what does the scientific literature and history of mRNA vaccines reveal about the possibility of a safe and effective SARS-CoV-2 vaccine? Here we're going to play a brief video just showing you the current standing of this vaccine as it relates to the Parliament.
We see the light at the end of the tunnel.
The good news, Canada has already secured 20 million doses of Pfizer's vaccine, thanks to a strategy Ottawa has been pursuing, not so quietly, for months.
When a vaccine is ready, Canada will be too.
The Government of Canada has entered into agreements with Pfizer and Moderna.
At least 8.
So as you can see, it's very clear that we do have a partnership with Pfizer, and we are rolling out the immunization campaign in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. This is an image showing you from the Health Canada website the authorization of the Pfizer and BioNTech vaccine. Since the beginning of the pandemic, vaccines have been presented as the only defense against COVID-19. This is made evident in Neil Ferguson's Report 9, the credibly criticized Imperial College of London report that locked down Canada and the world. We encourage you to reference our article at in24.ca for all relevant information on the credibility problems with this report, and for further evidence showing the expectation that an untested and new vaccine would be the only option for countries wishing to lift their extreme lockdowns. Here's a brief video actually describing the mRNA vaccine scientific protocol with a little bit of a description as to how it's different from traditional vaccines. So, to summarize, by making changes to synthetic mRNA and injecting people with it, any cell in the body could produce a spike protein, which then leads the immune system to recognize it and develop immunity. Now, it's clear, and we know this, that no mRNA technology has ever been brought to market, period. Although there is some history of the experimentation and there is some scientific literature on the subject of mRNA vaccines, which is precisely what we're going to investigate today. So let's investigate this authorization of this experimental vaccine and survey the positions of experts and physicians on all sides of the issue, starting with the facts. Firstly, on December 9th, 2020, Health Canada authorizes the first COVID-19 vaccine under interim order respecting the importation, sale, and advertising of drugs for use in COVID-19. This is specifically an order allowing for the emergency use and distribution of medications relating to COVID-19. The FDA granted a similar approval, which we're actually going to talk about shortly. The UK similarly has approved under an emergency order the use of this vaccine. So you can see in Canada, the US, and in the UK, this vaccine rollout is underway.
Now, is there any research done on how this vaccine can affect different races of people?
That's a really good question. In the FDA briefing document, there is some insight as to the demographics and how they experience AEs, which are adverse effects. Relating to this vaccine, there was no statistical anomalies, so that's something of note. However, there is a history of vaccines, how do you say that?
Affecting
Yes.
people differently depending on where they're from.
Exactly. And also there is a history of this information being covered up. For example, the MMR vaccines disproportionately affected people of color and created adverse effects that lasted throughout their lifetime. And the company putting forth this document, which is actually the company that was creating and tentatively distributing the vaccine once approval was granted, omitted that information. So
Isn't that plagiarizing?
well, we'll see. Actually, we're going to cover this in a few slides that, you know, we're going to look into who funded and conducted these clinical trials and how this possibly could have created a bias. And you know, we're going to be looking into if any information was omitted from the trials, and we can't technically speculate as to the reason why, although it's clear that Pfizer and BioNTech certainly do have a financial incentive correlating to the approval of this vaccine. So we'll look at those documents in a moment for sure. So as we mentioned, all nations are now administering this vaccine to their populations. So by making precise changes to synthetic mRNA and injecting people with it, any cell in the body could produce this spike protein, which then leads the immune system to recognize it and develop immunity. Although relatively easy and quick to produce compared to traditional vaccine making, no mRNA vaccine or drug has ever won approval. I know we've repeated this, but it's significant. This is since its emergence in the work of Catalin Carrico in the 1990s. Catalin, who is now a senior vice president at BioNTech, identified the problems with this approach. They are that synthetic RNA is extremely vulnerable to the body's natural defenses, meaning it's likely to be destroyed before reaching its target cells. And worse, the resulting biological havoc might stir up an immune response that could make the therapy a health risk for some patients. So let's go over a brief history of the scientific literature and the mRNA tests on humans and animals. So as we can see here, this is a study of the first ever mRNA vaccine tested on humans. It was a rabies vaccine. Scott. It was conducted on 101 healthy participants in 2014. No author affiliations included the pharmaceutical industry, meaning they were tentatively not biased. In the 7 days post-vaccination, 94 and 97% of intradermal and intramuscular vaccinated patients reported solicited injection site reactions, which means people who received the vaccines via injection. 78% of these injected vaccinated patients reported solicited systemic adverse effects, including 10 grade 3 events. Now, a grade 3 adverse event is defined by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services as a severe or medically significant but not immediately life-threatening hospitalization, prolongation of hospitalization, or anything that is limiting self-care, such as bathing, dressing, and undressing. So these events are characterized by the inability to pursue your daily life.
So this is basically saying that there is a reaction from vaccine. That's a normal thing to expect. And there are different stages of the reaction. So basically, you're saying 78% of people have the typical expected reaction to a basic vaccine.
Exactly. I mean, that's a great distinction, right? Localized reactions are extremely common. Of course, I mean, you're getting injected with something, you might get some discomfort, pain. The adverse effects are characterized in level of severity. So these localized adverse events are considered the lowest tier. Now, the adverse effects we're talking about here or alluding to are the grade 3 events, which included 10% of the participants. So 10% of the people participating in the study, and they were all healthy, experienced adverse effects that would limit their ability to perform daily tasks.
So what would that be? What is the worst reaction?
That could be anything from seizures to convulsions to muscle aches, whereas you literally can't get out of bed, muscular pain, fever, whereas you can't get out of bed.
And that was from the rabies vaccine trial.
This is the first ever rabies mRNA, well, the first ever mRNA vaccine trial ever conducted on humans. And the result was that 10% of the studied participants had adverse reactions to such a degree that they were unable to conduct their daily lives. Now, again, this is just a starting point, right?
Yeah.
We just want to see what the history is.
So extreme reactions to vaccines is not something new to expect. Okay.
No. And in this case, I mean, clearly the trial, 10% is significant. I can only assume that that's the reason that trials in this field were not pursued. And we're going to also go into other studies that continue evaluating the safety and efficacy of mRNA vaccines more broadly. Because in the corporate media, you see kind of just wholeheartedly that mRNA technology has never emerged, but it's something like a miracle cure. That's something that I've seen in the headlines.
Okay.
Yeah, so let's dive in. Here is another clinical trial. Now, here's another clinical trial included because it specifically targets a respiratory-borne virus. We thought that was interesting because the rabies one is specific to rabies. We thought if it's a respiratory pathogen, perhaps the conclusions will be different and more illuminating. So all of the researchers in this study were employed by Moderna or Valera, which is a Moderna venture. And they conducted tests in vitro, which means in cell cultures, not in live beings. But they also conducted it on live mice and ferrets, as well as on humans in a phase 1 clinical trial. Now, according to these scientists, mRNA vaccines can induce protective immunogenicity with acceptable tolerability profiles. Now, what that means is that these vaccines can produce a desired immune response, whereas you develop T cells or immunity to that specific pathogen that you're trying to create immunity towards. So it's a bit of a mouthful, immunogenicity, but it means basically that you have become immune to that pathogen. Yes. So despite the fact that they have said that these consequences or these vaccines have an acceptable tolerability profile, because as you alluded, vaccines do have what are generally regarded as normal reactions.
Exactly.
So they classified that as within those reactions. we looked a little bit deeper into it, and this is what we found. So if we look into the adverse effects on humans, we actually see that they are somewhat abundant. 66% of adverse effects were mild, 32% were moderate, and 13% were categorized as severe. Using the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research severity scale, mild adverse effects were defined as those having no limitations in normal daily activities. Moderate ones cause some limitation, and severe ones are defined as causing the inability to perform normal daily tasks. So that mirrors exactly what we were talking about.
What we said about, yes, okay.
Exactly. Now, as you can see, 10% is a significant ratio, so that's something to keep in mind, especially when we're contextualizing with the rabies vaccine, which was also 10% of severe adverse effects. Now, it would be so great to know, because I read this paper, of course, it would be great to know specifically what these adverse effects were.
Well, as they say, these are the most extreme reactions, what they're claiming to be, and at 10%, at least we can see that this has happened previously, and since the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine is being questioned on its legitimacy and what are the effects, and people need to be aware that there are studies, scientific studies, that show exactly that what percentages of people and what kind of reactions they've had.
And this is a good time to to note that this study was conducted in 2017.
So it's very recent and very, okay.
Exactly. So we're actually going to see, I mean, I don't need to tease because it's our next slide. So to summarize, there has been some data on the effect of mRNA vaccines on animals and humans. So this study is actually really, really interesting. Drew Weissman is a pioneer of mRNA technology, and he published in 2018 a comprehensive overview of mRNA technology in vaccines, as well as a few other researchers. He wasn't solitary in this. So according to the authors of this study, of one, as we have mentioned, had pioneered mRNA technology alongside Catalin Carico, some mRNA vaccine studies show great promise, and yet others demonstrate problematic risk profiles. This publication explores preclinical and clinical reports showing the efficacy of mRNA vaccines, whereas the majority of early work in mRNA vaccines focused on cancer applications. A number of recent reports have demonstrated the potential of these vaccines to protect against a wide variety of infectious pathogens, including influenza, Ebola, Zika, and Streptococcus viruses. So in some trials, the ability to provoke an antigen response was more modest in humans than was expected based on the animal testing. And the side effects were not trivial. So they caution that further research is needed to determine how different animal species respond to mRNA vaccine components and inflammatory signals, with which pathways of immune signaling are most effective in humans. So
is there a reason? Is there a reason that can back up why they do studies on animals and then humans? If I was the viewer, I would wonder why are there still testing done for vaccines on animals, and how do they respond? Like, is their response similar to when it goes into human trials?
Well, that's precisely the point of contention here that Weissman is bringing up. He's saying that, as far as I can tell, the reason that they test, first of all, in vitro and then in animals is to first in vitro test the plausibility of their claims. And then in animals, they're measuring the reaction of these animals because it would be unethical to conduct tests with zero kind of animal trials on humans because you need to prove your thesis, right? You need to actualize your theory and see how it manifests in clinical trials. So phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 are increasingly more broad and include more human beings into the trials.
So this is not about any kind of ethical animal question. This is simply to protect humans before the vaccine goes into trial into humans. It goes into animals, and then
These
are the stages of...
That's what, as far as I can tell, how the scientific community progresses through the testing of vaccines. And that's not only for vaccines. I mean, even for makeup and a wide range of products. Animals are utilized to demonstrate safety of products, especially non-human primates, because they're the closest in our genome. So definitely some ethical concerns, and that's a great discussion that we can have. Because is it possible to develop a technology without utilizing those potentially cruel behaviors towards animals? I don't know. It would be really, really interesting to be able to look at that. So of course, as always, we have the links to this article both on our website and in this PowerPoint that's going to be available to you on our website. So look through the data. Don't take our word for it. We're empowering you to empower yourself. So.